Channel 856,
92.7 and 106 FM.
21 minutes after 8. Mandilakhe Gcilitshana is my guest, Development and Employment Equity Specialist at Strata-g Labour Solutions. Mandilakhe, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. The new law, the Employment Equity Amendment Act, number 4 of 2022, has now been amended, and the President has signed in certain protocols or principles. What does this mean for business owners, particularly those who employ less than 50 people in their companies?
Good evening, Obi. Thank you for having us on your show.
Indeed.
Look, I think maybe as you've been, doing your introduction, explaining, let me just maybe reiterate what you were saying. So before the 1st of January this year, employers would be considered to be designated employers if they've got more than 50 employees, or if they have got less than 50 employees but meet a particular threshold in terms of their revenue as per Schedule 4 of the Employment Equity Act, and also if they're a state organ or a municipality, or they are bound by a collective agreement. Now, with the new amendments that you've been referring to, what now has come into play is that those employers who have got less than 50 employees and have been required to comply because of that, to a large extent, being excused. And that has got a huge implication, for those employers in many fronts. So take, for instance, if you're looking at it from the perspective of, the financial impact, those employers, the resources that they've been using to try and get, specialists like ourselves to try and ensure that they comply, or even try and, align their recruitment with the targets that they had to comply with, they get to use those resources to channel them to other items that are quite as important in their businesses. And this is not to say, that these employers don't see employee equity as, important as everything else, but they get to, lessen the burden, for these employers in terms of having to comply, and something that, from a practicality perspective, it's also a little bit trickier for them as well, because the fewer employees you have, the more difficult it is to diversify, your workforce. Take, for instance, the requirement is that you must align your workforce with the EAP, which is the economically active population, and that's the stats you get from the Department of Labor. So, in essence, you would be required to have a certain percentage of African people, colored people, Indian people, and white people, and consider the gender as well. Now, if you've got fewer employees, you will have a challenge of you might not get all of those demographics in terms of gender and race as well. So if you are no longer required now to comply, it then lessens the burden. But before I can, just pause on this point, I want to emphasize that these employers are still required to comply with Chapter 2 of the Act, which emphasizes the prohibition of unfair discrimination. So they are not necessarily being let to go from compliance in total. But like you were saying earlier on, they don't have to comply now with Chapter 3 of the Act, because that will only comply, or rather only apply to your designated employer.
When did the Employment Equity Act was adopted, whenever it was? What was the principal goal for the Employment Equity legislation?
So that would have been in 1998, obviously after, your 1994 and having the new, government that we have in our country.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the Act, if you go to Section 2 of the Act, there are two main things actually it seeks to try and address as per the purpose of the Act. The first one is to eliminate unfair discrimination in the workplace. Then the second one is to promote equitable representation of people from different demographics in the workplace. So the first part of it is still applicable to all employers, because no employers, as per Section 6 of the Act, are allowed to discriminate against employees, particularly in an unfair manner. Where then the challenge is for the small employers, it is the second part of trying to have an equitable representation of employees in their workforce. Then this is where now the government is saying, look, we are trying to stimulate the economy to create more jobs using small businesses. So if we're going to create this burden for them as well, it's actually now affecting what we're trying to achieve in trying to build a stronger economy. So by lessening the burden, it then puts these employers in a position where they can actually operate properly and be able to contribute in the issue of unemployment in our country. So it would be the act would have been adopted in 1998, and actually Section 2 of the act is what addresses your issue there.
Are we to understand these amendments and, of course, the signing into law by the president just before the end of last year, these changes, are we understanding them to be an indication that either the goals of the Employment Equity Act as envisaged back in the 90s have not been reached or have been reached, and we now move on to a different phase of the implementation of productivity in business? In other words, we are now making sure that businesses are focusing on their core business rather than, I suppose, the political cosmetics of the operations of a business?
So, Aubrey, I will tell you one thing, that the goals have not been met. I'm simply saying this. If you go and actually look at the report that is published by the Commission of Employment Equity Act every year, you will see that there is still a struggle in terms of achieving the transformation or equitable representation of different people in the workplace, particularly at management level. However, as I was saying earlier on, the challenge though that you face is that there's an element of this not being practical for smaller employers, because these employers need to then try and find different people from different demographics in their workplace, even when they have a smaller, workforce. I just give you an example. A strategy, we deal with employers that probably have about, let's say, 10 employees. But now, because of their turnover, they need to comply. So if you've got 10 employees, assuming that, let's say, in junior management, you've got 2 employees, the requirement by law is that you should be having a percentage of those employees being African male. It's usually around about 43.2%. If you're looking at African female, it's around about 38 point something percent. But where I'm going at now is that if you've then got 2 employees at that specific occupational level, you will have a challenge that you will be seen as non-compliant simply because you don't meet the other demographics, because you've got only fewer employees in that specific occupational level. Now, this is the challenge now that these smaller employees are now finding themselves in, where they aren't able to achieve the target as they're set, because they've got a very small workforce. But some of them, obviously, they might have slightly more employees, but still less than 50. They do, contribute positively to those numbers, but they don't necessarily add as much value. And you don't have a lot of these employers, that are less than 50, being designated employers. Hence, then the department is saying, you know what, let us reduce this burden on these employers. Let us allow them to focus on what they are doing to stimulate the economy so that we can create more jobs.
It sounds to me, Mandilakhe, as though there has been a reconsideration of the importance of diversity in the workspace over or versus the operational effectiveness of businesses. And it appears to me that the diversity conversation, or the diversity argument, has lost out in this case. I say this because those of us who were involved back then in the 90s with the conversation around the need for diversity, and regardless of whether or not people raised issues around, I can be as diverse as you want, but I won't have the skills and the people to be able to produce as I did when I didn't have the diversity. It appears that that argument or that battle has been lost by those that were the proponents of diversity. Would you agree with that sentiment?
And not necessarily, Audrey. Not necessarily that we would say that diversity has lost, because now what we will actually be perpetuating or trying to put or suggest with that argument is that diversity and being productive as an organization cannot go hand in hand, and that is not true. And it's amongst the things that we always a strategy try and emphasize to our clients, that you can be a diverse organization and still perform. But it goes back to what I was saying, that with the smaller organizations, the dynamics are a little bit different than your bigger organizations.
Sure.
So the big organizations, if you're looking at them, they're doing their very best. They're working, they're improving here and there. I mean, they are on a yearly basis. The department does recognize employers who are doing well in that spectrum in terms of being transformative, and they're still doing well. If you go, you will see that there are bigger businesses that actually being recognized, meaning that they're growing as well. So that alone should dismiss the idea that diversity and being effective as an organization or being productive cannot go hand in hand. But it goes back to what I was saying, that with a small organization, it is a little bit tricky to try and focus on all of these items. But yes, where possible, these small organizations as well can try, and contribute, even if they're compelled by law. And I'm saying this because we had quite a few of these smaller organizations that will no longer be required to comply. We said, look, strategy, we understand the requirements, by law. However, we want to continue with this concept of transformation and also diversity, because it has created a proper morale in our workspace. We've seen people, being productive, and also it has helped us to strategize effectively, because hand in hand with transformation is the idea of skills development, like you were saying earlier on. So when an employer foresees that in the near future I might not have a manager at a certain level, you can then train people at a level who are previously disadvantaged, so that you can beef them up so that they can go to those levels instead of always recruiting. And when you're doing that, obviously you are now encouraging your staff now to understand that you do recognize people who are performing and people who have got the skill that are within organization, vis-a-vis always going out and recruiting. So I want to emphasize that point again, that it is not necessarily the case that the department is now saying that diversity and production or productivity cannot go hand in hand, therefore let us excuse these employers. It's more of a practicality issue. Sure. That these smaller employers might find themselves having it as a burden instead of it being an advantage to them as well.
Give us a call, 011-883-0702. I'm speaking to Mandilakhe Gcilitshana. He's Development and Employment Equity Specialist at Strata-g Labour Solutions. Businesses that have 50 or less employees are no longer required to comply with Chapter 3 of the Employment Equity Act. And I'm asking the question, has the transformative or the transformation argument lost out here? You'll remember, Mandilakhe, that during those days, the argument was that transformation or nothing. I don't know if you were part of those conversations. There was that conversation that said transformation or nothing. And part of the thrust of the argument and the way by which people or companies were going to be motivated to engage in transformation was that it doesn't really matter. We want to see transformative movements in your business, or else we're going to ring fence you and we're going to cut you out of the mainstream economy. It was that hardcore. It looks to me like, if we are happy to say that it isn't a loss for the transformative agenda, that it is a, shall we say, a toning down of the intensity of the argument for transformation, for practicality's sake. And do you not envisage a situation where people are going to say that this is nothing more than a betrayal of the transformative agenda that was in place in order to level the playing fields? Or would you say that we are now at a place where we can talk about playing fields being leveled? I doubt that argument is going to work, but what are your thoughts as far as that is concerned?
Look, Aubrey, on the transformation on nothing, I know that probably amongst those arguments would obviously be some, political arguments, of which we don't want to, venture into at the moment. But the idea of transformation is still actually being, promoted by government.
But thoroughly toned down. You'd agree with me, huh?
Well, not necessarily in the sense that now there is Section 53 of the Act.
Yes.
That emphasizes that if you are going to be doing business with the state, you need to have a certificate of compliance.
Yep.
Right. So, that is something that has not necessarily, been there. Now, as means to try and encourage, more employers, particularly that are doing business with the state, you will then see now that there is a need for them to prove that, look, we're transforming. Because currently, all you had to provide to show that you are compliant, it's when you need to do your BE compliance, and you just need to submit the acknowledgement letter that you submitted your report. You need to submit the EA2 or the EA4, and then your workforce. And then you'll be then given the relevant points. But now, if you want to continue getting the contracts that are necessary with government in particular, you then need to provide a certificate that, one, you need to prove that you are complying with the relevant sector targets that are going to be implemented hopefully this year. And two, you need to prove that you're submitting your reports that help you to monitor your compliance. And if you have not achieved the targets of the EAP, which is now your non-compliant, you need to provide valid reasons why you are not achieving those targets. And then there are other requirements as well, where you need to prove that you don't have any findings from the CCMA relating to unfair discrimination, or the CCMA and the Labour Court to a large extent relating to matters where you are failing to pay minimum wage. So what I'm trying to show you here is that government, in a different, perspective, or in a different way, with this Section 53, they still try to encourage and show employers that it is still important. Now, with the smaller employers, so what I don't want us to do is to dismiss that because smaller employers are being exposed, we are then doing away with transformation. Companies that still have more than 50 employees, they are still required to comply with employment equity. They will still be required to align themselves with the EAP, which is under sectoral targets. It's just that it's these smaller ones. So it does not necessarily negatively affect the entire idea and concept. You need to understand here, Aubrey, that it would be unrealistic of government if they continue, implementing something to a large extent that is putting us, a step back in terms of the case of smaller organizations in particular. Similarly, if you're looking at the EAP as they are a combination of the statistics of who is employable and who is employed in generally in our country. The government now has revised that and said each industry will have its own sectoral targets in terms of the EAP. Top management, senior management, middle management, and junior management will have their own separate target as well, so that you can try and, pinpoint the issues for each industry. Because if you're going to the wholesale and retail sector, they don't have an issue of having females being employed in management, but they have an issue of males in particular, because the industry is overpopulated by females. But if you go to other industries like your mining, construction, and to a large extent manufacturing, there will be more males. But now, government has sat back and said, look, to be more realistic to the issue that we're having, let us then revise the EAP. So revising legislation doesn't necessarily mean then that the government is failing, but they are now approaching whatever they want to achieve from a different perspective.
Give us a call, 011-883-0702 or 021-446-0567. We're talking about the Employment Equity Amendment Act, signed into law by the President just before the 1st of January. Suppose, Mandilakhe, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about this after we've taken these calls, that there seems to be an ideological shift here. The very same arguments that you're putting forward this evening would have been put forward by those that were seen to be anti-transformation back in 1994, 95. I'm interested to find out what was the reason for the change in ideology here, because ideologically there seems to be a very substantial change here. Does it have anything to do with the fact that we are now in the GNU 7th administration? Does it have anything to do with the fact that some have said that, President Cyril Ramaphosa has been very much pro-business, and this is nothing more than him delivering on the promises of the reforms in business, which those who are perhaps proponents of the transformative agenda as per the old ideology, old meaning 1994, 95 ideology, may feel that this is a betrayal of that agenda at an political ideological level. I hear your practical explanations, right? But I suppose from one standing at a distance and watching this whole thing, one can't argue or ignore the fact that there is a fundamental ideological shift here. The rhetoric might sound right and all of those kinds of things. Not to say that it's wrong, not to say that it's wrong, but I'm simply saying that there's a fundamental shift ideologically here as to the transformative agenda. And I'm interested to know whether the politics of the day have anything to do with what we are seeing now. But before you answer that, I do want to take some of the questions that have come through. Cecil is in Roodepoort. Hi, Cecil.
Good evening, Audrey, and good evening to Mr. Mandilakhe. I'm just following up on a statement he made. It's quite interesting that he says, regarding turnover, if a company has less than 50 employees, it is exempt from the transformation agenda. But now, is that law in itself not creating a loophole for holding companies which have ideally less than 50 employees, and you find that the C-suite is not is excluded from the transformational agenda? Because in itself, I'm talking on the back of, if you look at the holding company that's holding Flight Safe, it's not a South African company. They're in hot water, but they can easily argue that we are just a holding company. We are not in direct business. So is that the amendment not creating a loophole for holding companies?
Interesting question. I mean, I know that those that are in the e-hailing business will probably ask the same thing about Uber and say, you know, we do we work for these guys or don't we work for these guys, and are they subject to some of these new laws? Cecil in Roodepoort, thanks very much. Great question. Let me speak to Ayanda in Boksburg. Hi, Ayanda.
Hello. Aubrey, I think it's a bit frustrating. It feels like a step backwards, because as it stands right now, all employers, regardless of